Welcome everyone to the very first Agile 100 online conference today. We are airing from Cologne, where I'm sitting, and Prague, where Zuzi is sitting. Zuzi, yes, you're waving to the crowd. Welcome everyone to the very first Agile 100 online conference today. We are airing from. Okay, I had to turn off my other tab. So now we're basically live. We do a few things quickly. Zuzi and I want to get out of the way as fast as possible so that you can hear from Jef Cumps and James Priest about Sociocracy. Zuzi, would you mind sharing a bit of the stuff about the Coaches Clinic quickly?
Yeah, so I would like to, well, hello everyone first. I would like to thank Sherry and Lucia for the big effort they put together to actually bring this Coaches Clinic here. They have about 30 super experienced Agile coaches who are willing to spend their time and help you with any issue you have or any question you have. So use it. It's in the networking tab.
Cool. Thank you for that. Highly recommended to go there. Now, a few things about the conference. This is the very first one, but this will be a recurring conference. So every month we have planned the next two in June and July. You will be able to connect with some of the best speakers in the Agile space. 10 of them or 11 of them in 10 talks are with us today. And today we also have around 206 people joining the conference. I hope most of you are right there from the start. And I would ask you to go to the polls tab to also participate in the polls so that all of us get a good sense of where the people are from, what jobs they do, and their level of experience. You can also network with each other and visit the sponsors that we have, the partners that we have, to whom we owe a lot of thank you in the expo section. Now, with no further ado, I would like to hand over to James Priest and Jef Cumps a few introductory words. James and I met a few years ago when he conducted a 3-day Sociocracy 3.0 workshop with us in Cologne. It was one of those transformational experiences for me. Ever since, we stayed in touch, but we didn't see each other again until yesterday, where I did the speaker onboarding. So it's so great to have you with us, James. And Jef is a very dear friend and fellow trainer colleague from the Scrum Alliance. We have collaborated on multiple situations, and I'm also very grateful to have you, James, as one of the co-founders of Eileen, working with us and sharing your experience with the crowd today. Both James and Jef also have a booth in the expo. So after the talk, feel free to go there, watch their videos, and if you're interested in their offerings, just connect with them through that. James, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you, Sorab, and thank you, everyone. So I'm very happy to be here today, proud and excited to be opening the conference. I'm going to attempt something ambitious, which is to give you a big picture overview of Sociocracy 3.0. The next 20 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to Jef, who's going to go into more details with some practical examples and so on to help you really apply what I'm going to share. Just for the record, I'm a co-founder of Sociocracy 3.0, along with Lily David and Bernard Bockelbrink, and Jef is a co-founder of Eileen, and I'll let him introduce himself later, but we've been working closely together for some years now, and it was Jef that introduced me to Sorab. So this presentation is called a social technology for organizational agility. And I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that shortly. So let's get into the presentation. I'm going to cover some about patterns today. I'm going to talk to you about principles, and I'm going to offer some key concepts from S3 and kind of hang elements of S3 onto those concepts to convey some kind of understanding to you. And I hope also by the end of this presentation, you'll have some real practical, actionable things that you can take away from this as well. So let's go into it. Now, the first question would be, what's sociocracy? And I'm sure many of you have heard the term democracy, although there's some interesting interpretations of what that means these days. But essentially, it meant rule by the demos, or those with voting privilege. So to understand sociocracy, you just need to replace demos with socius, which basically means the social group. And sociocracy means, in essence, rule by the social group. So I was saying that we look at S3 as a social technology. So it's basically an approach that people can use to influence social systems. And it can really support with developing agile and resilient organizations. So sociocracy in itself doesn't do that, But what it does is it presents a series of patterns that are versatile and adaptable, that were there long before S3 was actually, that people can use in situations where their current approach is inadequate to bring about the results they'd like. It also supports an iterative and incremental approach, which is going to be familiar to most of you in this audience, but not just in terms of service and product development, but also in terms of how you govern the organization and manage an organization as a whole. And finally, S3, all the resources that we create are shared under a Creative Commons license, because in our opinion, social technologies like this should be as accessible to people as possible, especially in these disruptive and really challenging times in which we live. So I said that it offers a menu of patterns. And what we mean by patterns is guidelines for successfully navigating specific contexts. I mean, guidelines, practices, just different ways of approaching things that can be helpful. And if you look at human behavior over time, certain patterns have prevailed and evolved because of their usefulness in certain contexts. We designed S3 in a way where the patterns can be adapted and evolved to suit the specific situations that people face. There's 74 patterns. I won't go into them all, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I did want to just introduce you to this perspective on the patterns, which is a set of categories that you can narrow down a little bit which patterns might be helpful for you. Patterns for organizing work, I'll mention briefly later, and you're super familiar with those, but also patterns for enabling co-creation and defining agreements, building and structuring organizations, and so on. So a good question is, why Sociocracy 3.0? It's got a long history going back to 1850, but S3 was our attempt to solve the problem that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to navigate complexity. And you know, there's so many methods and frameworks out there that you can use, and they're going to have more or less applicability in a certain moment, in a certain context. But what we did with S3 is we stripped back these methods and frameworks and took a look under the hood to see, you know, are there kind of core patterns that are consistent across these frameworks that can extract, codify, and share with people so that people have a kind of more modular way of approaching things. So one interesting observation about these patterns over time is how they can contrast our habitual ways of doing things. Yeah, so it's like when you bump into an alternative way of doing something and you're open to consider that, then you can kind of recognize some kind of constraints that are woven into that approach that may be different to how you do things as well. So another interesting insight over the last 5 years or so developing S3 has been to see that it's not so much about whether or not people use specific patterns from S3, but it's more about the fact that at the interface between habitual behaviors and alternative ways of doing things, there's this potential for greater consciousness. It's like, you know, we're running on our habitual behaviors on a daily basis, and that's a good thing because there's a lot to think about otherwise. But in those moments when our habitual approach fails to bring about the results we would expect or wish, then we can look to alternatives, including S3 patterns, and have a more informed and the capacity to make a more conscious choice about how to proceed. So the thing about patterns is, at some point or other, they're going to fall short. If you've got particular practices that work for you today, there's a good chance at some point soon they're going to need to be adapted and evolved. And when that happens, we need some kind of higher order set of guiding principles somehow that can help us to adapt things. And that's exactly what we do. We reference our values as human beings and the cultural values and the social values in moments when we need to evolve things. And they offer us these kind of meta guidelines for how to proceed. So principles, if you like, are guidelines for behavior. And in S3, we decided to name 7 of them explicitly. And I'm just going to run through them with you here, just to tell a brief story about how they interrelate. So equivalence is basically involving people in making and evolving decisions that affects them. I'm going to leave you to think about why that might be useful. But when you involve people in decisions that affect them, it's also important that people are reasonable. And so the principle of consent is an invitation to raise, seek out, and resolve objections to the way things are done, to decisions and actions in an organization. In order to achieve that, you also need transparency. So having a way to record information that's valuable for the organization and making it accessible to people, unless there's really a reason for confidentiality, is important and difficult at scale. Accountability, well, just to back up what I mean by accountability is if you take responsibility for something, then you become accountable for it. But you can take responsibility, but you can't take accountability. In an organizational system, there's a hierarchy of accountability. So responsibilities are delegated and distributed through the system, and accountability is shared throughout that system. So accountability is an invitation to respond when things are needed and do what you agreed to, but also to take ownership for the course of the organization and recognize your decision to collaborate with people in that system. And all of this should and could lead to greater effectiveness in the system. And effectiveness is about devoting time to what brings you closer to achieving your objectives, or you could say it's about focusing on creating value. And to help with that, the last two principles go hand in hand. One of those is empiricism, and the other one, continuous improvement. So bringing an experimental mindset to not just what you do, but also the decisions that you make, and solving things iteratively and incrementally on the basis of what you learn. So on to some key concepts from S3 then. Why are concepts useful, first of all? Well, when we understand concepts, it provides us with a common language, and that can really help us to deepen understanding and increase our capacity to have a shared model around the organization. And they also then enable a more constructive dialogue about the things that need to be done. And the first concept I want to introduce you to today is called driver. And driver is basically a person or group's motive for responding to a situation. Now, driver isn't new to S3, although describing it in quite this way, I think, is. But you're a driver spotting entity. Now, everything you do in life is in response to a driver that you're either currently aware of or a previous driver that was important for you to respond to in some way. And I'll say more about it in a while. A second concept is domain. And domain, again, is a concept you're familiar with, although you might not have called it by this name. It's a distinct area of activity, influence, and decision-making within an organization. So, for example, development, HR, accounting, Scrum Master. We take the sum of the work in an organization and we divide it up into parts, and we also distribute the limited resources we have across those different areas of work. And what I want to do today is paint a picture of us in a scenario where we're growing an organization together. So in the first instance, let's say there's 3 of us, and we've become aware of a driver that's motivating us to act in some way. And if you look at a driver and you decide to respond, then you're going to see that there's an area of work that relates to that driver. So this would be the domain, and within it are the resources that are available. Now, the thing about responding to drivers is that over time we start to realize there's a whole bunch of things that need doing. I don't know if I had a bright idea and you think that'll be finished by this evening, and then it turns out it was much more involved than you imagined. And so there comes a point in an organization where there's just too much to be handling. And so what we typically do in an organizational system is we define subdomains within the system, and we delegate influence subdomains to other people who take responsibility for them. And then you, as delegator in that case, retain overall accountability. And this is how systems grow, whether it's a top-down system from a few to many, or in the case of a community, for example, where everybody's the delegator and they delegate influence to people to be able to handle the work effectively. So it's really helpful to clarify domains. And this is a pattern from S3, which Jef will go into details about. But when you clarify domains, you can be explicit about the responsibilities of the delegator. You can be explicit about why the domain exists and what important responsibilities need to be taken care of. You can also be clear about the resources that are available and the various constraints on people's autonomy within the domain, and a number of other elements too. So if we go back to our scenario of growing our organization now, we've started to delegate influence for domains. And the way people typically respond to domains in organizations is either with roles or teams. And I do want to add the caveat here that there are other ways to account for work in an organization. These days we have AI, we've had automation for a long time. Animals came up the other day. I was in a webinar last week and I made a joke about donkeys accounting for domains in an organization. But ironically, somebody in the call was on a farm and had a donkey in the room that they were in. So that was quite unexpected. So there's many ways we account for them. Typically in organizations, roles and teams are what we're familiar with. And in S3, we talk about 3 different types of teams: circle, helping team, and open domain. I'm not going to go into details on those today, but I will come back to circle in a while. And we need to deal with dependencies between domains as well. Linking between domains to flow information and influence across them is a very helpful way to keep systems open, account for dependencies, and ensure that activity in one area doesn't cause disruption you wouldn't wish in another. And of course, we need somebody often to carry that information or be a representative, and that's a defined role in S3. So what you're seeing here are the patterns in S3 for building organizations. And when we put all those together in organizational systems, then you start to see a variety of different organizational structures. There's many ways to structure organizations. S3 just explicitly names 6 patterns, but not that you choose one and discard the other 5. It's more you look across the spectrum of options available for you and ask, how can we most effectively structure the system to be able to flow information and influence in a way that enables the maximal creation of value? Delegate circle pattern that Jef will mention later. But other than that, we won't go into any more detail on this today. So we've put together our organization, people working, taking responsibility for different domains in roles and teams. But how do you bring agility across a whole system, especially at scale? Well, for that, S3 makes explicit a pattern called navigate via tension. And to understand the pattern, it's useful to know what we mean by tension. So I'm talking about an inner state of alert. You know, when everything's fine, then we just go about our day. But when we see something that's different to what we expect or wish to see, we experience some kind of tension. And that's useful because it keeps us alive on a daily basis. It helps us to move away from impediments, and it helps us to move towards tools and opportunities that would be useful for us in achieving our goals. So we're kind of hardwired to react to situations often, but navigate via tension invites that we pause between stimulus and reaction or response, and check a few things. So I'm going to run through navigate via tension in pieces and then use that as a way to build up on the remainder of what I'll share with you this morning. So navigate via tension. Pay attention to tension. Understand why you experience tension. What is it that's happening and needed there? Check the relevance of that situation and ask, who's responsible for this situation? Is it you? Is it somebody else? And if it's somebody else, then passing that information on to them so that they can respond and evaluate and evolve as a consequence of their response. So this is common sense. We do it all the time, just more or less consciously. And maybe the added element in an organization is this question of who's responsible. And so clarifying domains is going to really help with answering that question. So understand why brings us back to drivers, understanding the motive for responding to a situation. And it's helpful to describe briefly, a bit like user story, summarizing drivers is a similar concept, talking about what's happening and what's needed in the organization, getting into explicitly saying what's the current situation and why it matters, and also what's missing somehow, what is needed and what might be the impact of responding to that need. And once again, Jeff's going to give you some examples around this later. It's important to check drivers are relevant to respond to, because we're responding to drivers all the time and they might not be relevant to the organization. So it's important to ask, would it help the organization if we respond to the driver, or would it harm the organization if we don't? It's not about importance, but about relevance, getting that information into the consciousness of the system through whoever became aware of it first, and then prioritizing accordingly so that people can respond in an appropriate way. So this topic of who's responsible brings us back to domains. And I just want to make a point here. Just because you clarify domains in an organization doesn't mean that if there's something you can do yourself, you don't do it. It's that principle of accountability, being responsible for the course of the organization. But in some cases, you're going to realize you become aware of something that needs responding to, but it's not going to fall into your area of competence or expertise, or it's somebody else's responsibility. So passing drivers to others informs them about the situation that you became aware of. And having a clear summary is going to really help with communication and ensure that information can arrive in a clear way to those people. So ways people respond to drivers in organizations, whether they're board members or not, falls into two categories. One of them is operations, and Agile puts a lot of energy into supporting people to develop effective operations. But the other category is governance. And I want to say briefly something about both of these in the remainder of the talk. So operations basically is doing the work that needs to be done and organizing the work within constraints that are defined through governance. And governance itself is the act of setting objectives and making and evolving decisions that guide people towards achieving them. So in terms of operations, there's many patterns you're familiar with, like visualizing work, prioritizing backlogs, call system for work and limiting work in progress, and different meetings that support people to organize work and learn, like planning and review meetings, daily stand-ups, and retrospectives. So these are the patterns for organizing work in S3. But there's also a category of patterns that support iterative decision, support the governance side of things. And sociocracy in general shifts from managed teams to circles. And a circle is basically a self-organizing, but also self-governing group of people responding to a common driver. So it's a good question to ask when and when to invest in collaborative decision-making. So there's a few elements to consider. One, when you're responding to complex issues, we're not smart to navigate complex levels. To harness diversity, dissent, and novelty, it's useful to get diverse perspectives, but also to increase ownership of decisions, because when people have a sense of ownership of what's decided, then they're going to be more accountable in how they respond. And whatever decisions you're making, S3 is also enabling maximum autonomy. So effective collaborative governance should be freeing people up to create value as much as possible. It's not about coming together all the time to talk things through, but about supporting people to be able to get on with things. And finally, to sum this up, the last two concepts from S3 I wanted to share with you today. One of them was agreement, which speaks for itself, a guideline, process, or protocol that's designed to guide the value, and objection. And an objection is basically an argument that reveals unintended consequences that you want to avoid or worthwhile ways to improve things. And when you're navigating via tension, you're not only opening to the consciousness of the system for people to bring drivers into that system and inform the people who need to know, but you're also inviting people to bring forward arguments when they see potential problems or opportunities to improve, harnessing the collective intelligence so that you can more effectively respond to your needs. So I'm going to stop my presentation right here, and I'm going to hand over to Jef to pick up and continue. So thank you so much, and I'll catch you at the end of this for some Q&A.
Hello everyone. So while James stops sharing his screen, so I can start sharing mine, I'll switch to the presentation. So there we are. Hi everyone. So when Saurabh asked James and me to do this session, we were very happy to share about sociocracy with you. And James spent 20 minutes explaining the concepts and some really important patterns from sociocracy. And I wanted to deepen that, provide some examples, but also provide my perspective on this as an Agile coach. So just so you know who I am, I live in Belgium together with my two kids and my wife. One of the founders of Agile100, which is a consultancy company in Belgium, helping organizations to become successful and agile. And I can very much relate to you and this Agile community because I've been a Scrum trainer and a coach myself before becoming an S3 coach and trainer. And I wrote this book about sociocracy, which you can find out more in the booth. So that's all about me. I wanted to share. And I wanted to take a client-focused perspective. Checking whether you can all see me now. Yeah, I wanted to take a more client-focused perspective and answer these 3 questions. 1, how does S3 and the patterns and the principle support agile self-organizing teams? Because that's a question we typically get from customers. They start with becoming more agile, implementing things such as Scrum or Kanban or any other method, trying to build self-organizing teams. And then we've noticed that some of the S3 patterns are really helping out customers. And I want to share a bit about that, but also about scaling. Scaling Agile is a big thing with lots of frameworks and methods and stuff. And also S3 patterns have been helping ourselves and our customers a lot. So I want to share a bit about that and deepen some of the things James have been explaining. But also decision-making, the last thing James was talking about, objections. I want to show you in a bit more depth what it is, because it's of great help in customers when they start to become more agile and when management tries to help form and support self-organizing teams. So that's the 3 questions I'll try to answer. How does S3 support self-organizing teams? Well, there's lots to say about a self-organizing team, but 3 things that I find really important and necessary conditions, let's say, are that a team, whether it's a team doing Scrum or Kanban or whatever approach they take, they should have a shared and inspiring purpose, a goal, something they could all together work towards. They need to have clarity on their area of responsibility, and they need to get the right kind of support from their wider context, not only management, but the entire organizational context. Let's see how S3 helps in reaching these things, but be aware there's more requirements for a really awesome team, such as it being stable and small, probably being self-selected, or at least people consenting to the team composition, etc. But I want to focus on these 3 things. A shared inspiring purpose. I immediately link to the concept of, or the pattern, sorry, of describing a driver. James has explained what a driver is, the motive for a team to start doing things, to get into action. Basically answering these 2 questions. What is happening and what is needed? And the driver can play at very different levels. There's drivers inside me right now, which I'm responding to, but also an organization can have a driver, like a reason for creating an organization initially. And also a team could have a driver as its reason for its creation. And that's what I want to talk about, because formulating or describing the driver of which this team is a response to, let's say, is a very useful thing. An example of a team I recently saw being created based on this driver. So due to COVID-19 measures, a company was no longer able to run physical workshops, and they needed to develop online materials and training and coaching to be able to effectively support their customers. This driver was agreed upon, and using the pattern of navigating via tension brought to the right place in the organization. And this organization decided to respond to this driver by forming a team, a self-organizing team. So this became the goal or the purpose of this team. And so next they could start to make clear what the area of work and responsibility was. And then we get to the concept of a domain. Domain is the playing field, let's say, in which this team can start doing its work. And James already mentioned the domain description, and I want to show you a little example just to show how it works in practice. First of all, a domain description needs a driver, so the why, but also the delegator, who's delegating the work to the team or the individual. Key responsibilities, constraints and resources, preferred skills and qualities, and evaluation time and criteria. These are the important elements of describing a domain. And just to show you a brief example, I won't go into all the details, but so you get a little bit a feel of it. For this online teaching and facilitation team, we've already mentioned the driver. And key responsibilities could be developing materials to work online, translate workshop formats or training course formats to online work and learning, and choosing and teaching about all the necessary tools. And by expliciting these responsibilities, it gets clear to what sub-drivers of this primary driver people in this team should respond. Resources and constraints help to really set the playing field and to be clear about what is it we can expect from people stepping into this domain. For instance, in this case, it's only about B2B workshops, not the B2C products and services of this organization. They get a budget of 20,000 euros a month, which could be both a resource like you get the money to do stuff, but also a constraint. You only get 20K per month. They should be GDPR compatible, etc., just as some examples. In this domain description, you should also list what are the preferred skills or experience or qualities or knowledge of people stepping into this domain, which helps for selecting, but also later on for reviewing whether or not people are effectively responding to the driver. That's the primary driver of the domain. Not shown in this example, but I do want to mention is evaluation time or period or cycle and criteria, because it's really important to evaluate frequently whether or not we as an organization are effectively addressing this driver, the driver for which this team exists, right? And so you need to set an evaluation cycle. Maybe we're going to review every month or every 5 months, and some criteria to check whether or not we are reaching the impact we want to by responding to this driver. So that's an example of a domain description. A third element we find is very important when setting up self-organizing or agile teams is finding and establishing the right relation between the management, the wider organizational context, and the team itself. And therefore, I want to link back to what James has been explaining about delegation. So if this is our team with a clear driver and a clear area, someone, the delegator we call it, is delegating this responsibility to the team or an individual, which we would call a role. And at the same time, the delegator, which could be another team, or maybe the management team, maybe the CEO, whoever is delegating, also stays accountable for both the driver and the domain of this team. And that's a relationship we should establish. So the delegator has the end responsibility or accountability for driver and domain, and delegates the responsibility for doing all the necessary work and governance within that domain to the team. And they need to together frequently review that. And those are three, let's say, main aspects of delegation for me. And that's when we can talk about semi-autonomy and a semi-autonomous team. And so these three things we set up with clients when they start building or creating self-organizing teams, and they really help. That's why I wanted to share. One more question. Because I see a lot of confusion in organizations, at least in Belgium here, is some confusion between, are we now a self-organizing team or a self-managing team or a self-governing team? And it's important to answer that question because it's part of that clear area of work and responsibility and the way we respond to a certain driver. For now, we've been using the word team. James mentioned circle and helping team, which are different ways of having a group of people respond to a driver within a domain. And self-organization links for me to operations, meaning organizing, planning, and executing the work. And self-governance, self-governing links to governance, of course. And governance means to also together decide on how to do the work and set constraints to that, and maybe decide on your own working processes or your own substructures. And it's really important to be clear about whether a team is only self-organizing, which we would call a helping team in Sociocracy 3.0, or when a team is both self-organizing as self-governing, we would call it a circle, which is one of the basic patterns in S3 for organizational structure. And that's what we would consider a semi-autonomous team and a good basic building block for Agile organizations. All right. So that was the first question. Which of the S3 patterns are supporting Agile and self-organizing teams? How does S3 help to scale Agile? Well, let's consider this an organization with its main driver, the purpose of the organization, the primary driver, we would call it. And I want you to become aware of the fact that there's a relationship between all drivers that are alive in an organization. James already mentioned that a driver should be qualified and checked whether or not responding to a driver would help the organization. And this way you get a relationship and sometimes even a hierarchy between drivers in an organization. And this is the way drivers can help us to build organizational structure. James has shown you many possible patterns in that, but basically you build your own structure based on what drivers are showing and how you prioritize drivers. To respond to these drivers, we could use the building blocks we've been mentioning. Circles, which is a semi-autonomous, self-organizing, self-governing team, maybe a Scrum team or a Kanban team or whatever. Roles is where people individually respond to a driver. And agreements. There are some others, such as helping teams, etc. But this way we get an organizational structure of semi-autonomous groups or individuals responding to drivers, and also doing frequent governance meetings to evolve. So not only doing the work, but also evolving their own structures, their own processes, and their own way of handling things, causing this organizational structure to continuously move and adapt and reinvent itself. And so it's not only being iterative and incremental on building products, as we Agile people are all aware of, but also being iterative and incremental about evolving our own organizational structure. So the structure is not changed top-down from one person or one department, but every domain or every self-governing domain, such as a circle, is changing its own structure and substructure in relation and in consent with its delegator. And that's how an organizational structure can start living and evolving, just like a natural organism does. One specific structure we would like to mention is when there's 3 or more circles that are doing their own work, their own governance, but in a way their domains overlap in the sense that they could make governance decisions that impact the others. And when that is not just happening once or twice a year, but frequently or in a structured way, then these circles need to find a way to get along and make decisions together. And one specific way is when they would each send one person, which we would call a representative, to a new circle. A new circle, which you would call a delegate circle. But it's not a typical circle doing work and governance, no. A delegate circle is only doing governance. So this is, in our example, 3 people from 3 different circles maybe coming together to make those governance decisions that are affecting all 3 circles. And this way we don't need traditional management to make these decisions top-down, but it's the people themselves, represented by their representatives, making these decisions to assure that these 3 teams or circles can collaborate well and deliver the right products and services. So this is a pattern called delegate circle, a very typical pattern of handling these issues. All right, that were some of the answers on how S3 helps to scale Agile, which is for me basically scaling semi-autonomy. James mentioned that this is about freeing up people as much as we can to do the necessary work. And so that's also how S3 patterns help here. Final question I want to answer is, how does decision-making work in S3? Because by now you've noticed that that's really important. The way decisions are made shows us how power is distributed. And the principle of consent was inviting us to embrace objections and go out and seek objections. And we want to be working together in equivalence, so involving people in decisions that affect them. So let's look at decision-making. For me, this is the basic question we would typically ask. Are there any objections? Which is a very different question than, does everyone agree with this? So collaborative decision-making in Sociocracy 3.0 does not mean seeking consensus, meaning finding all yeses and making sure everyone loves the solution and agrees. No, we are looking for objections. And as James explained, an objection is not something bad or negative. No, it's a gift. It's a piece of wisdom that was still missing in an initial proposal, right? And it's showing us a reason why a proposal might cause unintended consequences, maybe cause harm we didn't want it to, or we miss an immediate improvement. And so we need a way to go find these objections. And what S3 brings us or offers us is the consent decision-making process. I won't go into too much detail now, it would take much more time, but I do want you to get a sense of how that happens. And so instead of going through all the 8 or 9 steps and including the pattern of resolving objections, I'm going to give you a more brief summary of consent decision-making. It all starts with a driver. First, we need to know why we are wanting to make an agreement. So let's assume there's a driver, we've qualified it, it's a priority thing, a governance driver, and we need to make an agreement on it. Then we need to find ways to probably or ideally co-create a proposal. So there's also patterns in S3 to co-create proposals, but you need to have a proposal that helps us respond to this driver. The proposal doesn't need to be perfect, definitely not, because now we are seeking whether or not there are any objections to the proposal. By asking this question, are there any objections? Which is actually the same as asking, is this proposal good enough for now and safe enough for us to try? So we are not looking for perfect agreements. We are looking for good enough for now agreements, because also as an organization and within our agreements and structures, we are continuously learning and evolving. So this is a very important question. Is this proposal good enough for now and safe enough to try? If all people in the circle, for instance, think it is, then there's no objections, and then we have an agreement, which we should evaluate and evolve whenever needed, right? But let's assume some people think it's not good enough, then they may have an objection. And an objection is not just a personal preference. It's not that because I like light blue instead of dark blue that we need to change the color of our logo. No, an objection is revealing a reason why the proposal isn't good enough or why unintended consequences might or will happen. So we need to first validate an objection and have it show its reason. When it gets validated, or qualified is the correct English word, then we have an objection, and then we do want to amend the proposal because the proposal was no longer good enough or safe enough for now. So we amend the proposal, we add or change to it what is minimally needed to make it good enough for now. We consider this the new proposal, we check again for objections. So by going into this cycle until there's no more objections, you can easily reach agreements. Agreements that are good enough for now and safe enough to try, and to which there are no longer any objections. So this is a basic summary of how consent decision making can work. And it could be as easy as just asking, hi, I propose we do A and B to respond to this driver, any objections? Or you could dig into the S3 pattern of consent decision making and the pattern of resolving objections to find out much more detail and a process that guides you through this. All right, that was the last question I wanted to answer. So how does decision-making work? And these are the other two questions we've covered. So I'd like to thank you for being in this session. If you want to learn more about Sociocracy 3.0, there's a Sociocracy30.org website. There's the learns3.org website. And there's also the book I've written. And there's the two booths that James and I will hold on this conference, in which you can find out more about the book or about the learning community that James and Bernard or Lily are starting about sociocracy. So thanks a lot, and I hope you'll have a lot of questions for the Q&A session that's coming up right now.
Perfect. Thank you, Jef and James. Also great timing. We have around 11 minutes left for the Q&A so that then we can get the next speakers onboarded. Now, there were a few questions, and I'll start with the one that Thoralf addressed early on. And Jef, you already answered this briefly through the chat, but maybe James wants to also talk a bit about this. And the question about to what extent S3 and liberating structures are connected or related.
Yeah, okay, well, they're interrelated in the sense both are presenting patterns of behavior that are useful in certain contexts, complementary. And we've really left liberating structures to its own kind of place because there's so many useful patterns there for facilitating collaboration, dialogue, harnessing collective intelligence. And so that, along with, now I forget what we're talking, Art of Host, for example, also offers a set of patterns that are useful for people to be able to work together in more effective ways. So they're related and complementary. And both of them have their own value to bring. And on that, I just wanted to pick up, I think Thoralf also said it looks very similar to Scrum at Scale and Scale Daily Standard Teams Delegate members to get a jointly releasable increment. And the reason it looks similar to that, or if you look at some of the patterns in S3, it looks similar to Scrum, or is because Bernard and I, when we first put this together, we looked at these different methods and frameworks and literally extracted the core patterns that were useful there. So build Scrum at Scale or Scrum or Holacracy and various other approaches out of the building blocks that S3 offers.
Cool. Thank you for that. Then there was another question coming in from Saad, and this was about how would we avoid silos of information within the specific domain. And he believes the goal is to give end-to-end ownership to domains. And if that's the case, when won't it produce risk of silos information?
All right. Shall I give a first response to this?
Yeah.
So sure, there's this risk, Saad, but whenever someone would, for the first time, feel this tension inside him or her of, hey, there's a silo of information starting to exist, accountability would ask us to formulate that as a driver and bring it into the right domain, right? So the thing you describe is just another driver that's going to pop up in an organization, brought to the right people and responded to, right? And so that's the way I would look at it. So yes, there's always the risk, but if in an organization people take up accountability and want to work in equivalence, someone will bring up this driver and start responding to it. Yeah. Anything to add, James?
Yeah, I would. So, we're very used to living attention and ignoring it somehow. But in the end, there's a consequence to this. And so navigate via attention is really saying, pay attention, like use your sensitive instrument, become aware of the things that catch your attention, because for sure you're perceiving something that's different to what you expect or wish to see. And I had a really nice story. I was in India and a coach came to a meetup that I ran. And afterwards he came to me and said, this is really, really great. I see lots of value, but in my teams, and then he went on to describe this problem. And I said, well, that sounds like a driver. How would you describe it? So he described it, and then I asked him what he'd do, and he said, well, I think maybe this. And I said, well, that's kind of how S3 works. You become aware of drivers and you bring together the appropriate people to respond. Anyway, he then said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But in my teams, and he did this 6 times, right? And after the 6th time of going through this process, he said, but in my teams, and then he stopped himself and the lights came on. And he said, now I get it. Thanks a lot, man. And that was the last I ever saw of him. He walked out of the, so this is navigate via attention. You're using human beings. We're like nerve endings in a living system, So just like nerve endings in our system help us to respond as a whole. So navigating via attention is a kind of contractual agreement where people play that game of navigating via attention to create a more conscious and responsive system.
Cool. Thanks, James, and also Jef for this response. Now we have a question from Jana, and her question is, response to a driver as governance. Can you give an example for this, please?
I don't really get the question, but I think I'd say that there's 2 kinds of drivers, operational drivers and governance driver, where an operational driver is inviting us to do some work and get into action, while a governance driver is requiring us to together make a decision about how we are doing the work. Sometimes we compare governance and operations with flowing water to the sea being operations, doing all the work and getting the water to the sea is operations, and the banks of the river and changing them so the water can flow more easily is called governance, right? So the first thing you'll need to find out is whether the driver is an operations driver, so just inviting us to do some work, or a governance driver and inviting us to together make or change any agreements we have. If the latter is the case, then bring it into a governance backlog, prioritizing across your other governance drivers. And if it's a top priority, get the right people together and find an answer to it or a response. Yeah. Anything else, James?
No, I don't think so on that one.
Okay.
Cool.
Great.
So we have the other question from Josh, and Josh was asking, as delegates are accountable for the driver and its success, how do you prevent that person reducing the autonomy of the circle?
Okay, so when you've got a delegate who delegates influence to people and the buck stops with them, basically, how do you ensure that they don't constrain those people too much? Yeah, well, the answer to that is you can't, right? Because people do what they do. And when people have authority, then they'll use that for better or worse. But the question to ask is, how can you enable people to maximally create value throughout the organization? So as a delegator, that's a question that's in your interest to answer, right? Something that I've been learning about domains, because I've been learning about S3 these last years too, since we launched it, is that in a management hierarchy, authority lies within the management hierarchy. But we know that it's very difficult. Well, you can't manage complexity in a centralized way. You need to mobilize people to act and respond throughout a system at scale. But where does the authority go? You don't take all the walls down and just tell people do whatever they like, because that's going to turn out very badly. And you're going to have to revert back to an even tighter kind of rigid hierarchy. But domains and give you a kind of objective environment within which to install authority. So a delegator needs to think, how do I design a domain, distribute or allocate resources, clarify responsibilities in a way that helps the people who take responsibility maximally create value. And then that main description provides an interface where delegator and delegatee can come together and dialogue around how successful that domain is in its current form, right? So domains can hold the authority of the system, and provide an interface for delegator and delegatees to share perspectives, evolve structure of the organization based on what they learn.
Perfect.
And
Anything
one
to
other
add
thing
from your
maybe
side,
to say, just one other thing on this is when you're developing products and services in an Agile where you're having fast feedback loops, right? So you learn fast. Well, it's the same with agreements in an organization. You want fast feedback loops. So you evaluate whether a decision was good enough, safe enough or not. And this includes your domain description, right? How you create a domain is an agreement in itself. So you regularly evaluate that domain and evolve it on the basis of what you learn.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And would you use the concept of retrospectives for that, as I saw in the presentation, James or Jeff?
Sure, one place. So retrospectives lead to operational drive and governance drivers, right? Either can come out of those. But you can install a retrospective as a pattern anywhere. You know, I really like to bring retrospectives into a team, and maybe you spend a day where every 15 minutes you stop and do a 2-minute retrospective. What are we doing? What's going well? What could improve? Yeah? And the same within governance, but in governance, you would formally set a date by which you would evaluate an agreement to check whether it's still relevant, if things have changed, and how it might be improved.
Yeah. I mean, we saw this during this COVID crisis with the governments around the world doing way more communication to the people based on the frequency as they were learning. So I think that's a great ending to this. James, Jeff, thank you so much again for participating in this first Agile 100 online conference. Whoever has additional questions, just type them in the booth. Maybe James and Jeff stick around a few more moments and register your interest. And I can highly recommend Jeff's book. I loved it. Thank you so much. I would stop the broadcasting now. See you in about 5 minutes with the next set of speakers, Gabrielle Benefield and a few of her colleagues.
Bye-bye. Thank you.